Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, you have the second half of my February wrap-up. There will probably be a lot more books than in the first half, even though, according to Storygraph and Goodreads, I'm ahead of schedule, so I'll take that. I do actually record these wrap-ups after I finish the book because a lot of them are library books, and I'm not going to just hold on to it until the end just because I want to have the book to hold up when I'm doing the wrap-up. So you get my fresh thoughts. The next book I read is The Mysterious Howling in the Incorrigible Children of Ashton Place series. I haven't compiled it yet. This will probably be an average read for me. It does follow a lot of typical tropes with the very prim and proper former orphan. Well, I mean, she's still an orphan. She was raised to be all prim and proper, and she goes and finds these incorrigible children who apparently raised by wolves, and she's expected to be their governess. So it follows a very typical format. I could not place my finger on what time period the author intended to place it. I'm thinking early 1800s, maybe late 1700s even, but a lot of this stuff sounds Victorian. But with some other things that she put in here, like some of the other illustrations seem a lot older than Victorian age. I don't think there was really any detailed characterization of any of the characters, including Penelope, the main character. The children all seemed basically the same, and everyone else seemed not great people. I didn't really engage with it. I don't think it was bad. I just think it's been done so many times before. I did find the ending a little bit intriguing, but I'll probably look up plot synopses. This will not be a series that I continue. The next 4 books that I have to wrap up, I do not have physical copies for. 2 of them because I read them on audiobook, 1 because I read it on ebook, and the last one because I returned it to the library. So we'll start with the ebooks first. I will not take too long to wrap up the first of those 2 audiobooks, and that is Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. It still remains my favorite of the 7 books. It is the longest, so it did take me a little bit longer to get through it. The other audiobook that I read is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. I read this to complete one of the Storygraph challenges, and that was to read a book popular that week when I selected it. And The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is a very popular book. Very popular, especially around the winter of 2020, 2021. And of course, I wasn't on BookTube around that time. I didn't know much about it. Since that time, since joining BookTube, I have read a couple, well, 3 V.E. Schwab books, and those are her middle grades books, because the last of those, that trilogy, was on the Goodreads Choice Award. And so I knew that I didn't have a problem with V.E. Schwab's writing style, and that she had some intriguing concepts. And I will say, with The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, she definitely has very intriguing concepts. And I talked a lot about my experience going through it in one of my reading blogs the week where I read that. I never disliked the book, but I also never started rooting for the love interest for the fact that that was a love interest. I thought that Addie had a lot of different quote-unquote loves, and each time a memory is brought up, it seems like she absolutely loves them and is gutted that they don't remember her the next day. Which, you know, I get, but also if you want to make Henry the boy who actually remembers her after 300 years, if you want to make him the one that she goes for, you've got to do something else with the romance than what you've done with all of the other romances that she describes. And I think maybe she thought she was, but I never saw that. I also never really liked Henry as a love interest. I think I didn't dislike him as a character, but I think he had so many problems himself that he had no business being in a relationship. It was not healthy for him to be in a relationship. It was codependent. he had so many issues to work on. That's another reason why I didn't buy that pairing. I also really didn't buy the other pairing in the book. It's hard to know how much to say about that one without spoilers, so I'll leave it at that. I tried to predict how this would end because you could see all the different options. You could think about all the different options because Addie had brought them up, had discussed them either in her own head or with Luke, the entity that gives her this deal. All of them either ended poorly, didn't end, ended unsatisfactorily. I couldn't find anything that wouldn't be ultimately depressing. V.E. Schwab almost got there. I think she added too much to the ending. One more perspective, one more add-on to the chapter. A lot of times epilogues feel unnecessary. In this case, it wasn't an epilogue. It was the last chapter, the last POV. I think the book would have had so much more impact without that, because you're left wondering how something resolves at the end, and I think that makes it more satisfactory than Schwab giving us the answers with that last chapter. Then we come to the ebook that I read. The ebook that I read was Solimar, and that's on my wish list now. I have always loved Pam Muñoz Ryan's writing. Solimar is a middle grades novel. It deals with, I think you would call it magical realism. I'm not 100% sure what exactly goes into that, but I think because it's not fully fantastical and it's set in reality, and a lot of Latinx, like magical realism started in Latin America. And Latinx authors are the ones that made it famous. I do believe it was magical realism. But Solimar is the title character. She is about to turn 15. Now, she does read young, which definitely makes this a middle grades book, as does the whole coming of age, finding yourself sort of idea. But I love Solimar. She's so genuine. I also love the design on this cover. It's set in one of the kingdoms of Mexico. Around the time that it's supposed to be set, there weren't any kingdoms in Mexico, but these are the so-called fabled 12 kingdoms of Mexico. It's supposed to be, I think, after the Spanish are pushed out. Now we know, according to actual history, once the Spanish were pushed out, it became a republic. I love the idea of giving the Mexican people, the people of this area, their power back, basically. And that's what this does. It gives them, it raises them up as equals in the eyes of, any other being on the planet, which a lot of people don't see. And I absolutely love that. It's hard to put that into words. Well, Solimar goes to see I forget what the name of it is, but the monarch butterflies migrate in the area, and they've come to the area or they're about to leave. I'm not sure where it is in the process, but it's a special day, and she goes. She's not supposed to, but she goes, and it's amazing. But in the process, she becomes the person who is going to save the monarch butterflies that are not quite strong enough because they're in danger of dying and dying out. A bit of the magical thing that comes as part of that is she has to be able to give them enough sunlight so that it strengthens them. But at the same time, if she gives them that sunlight, then if someone asks her a question in the sunlight, she automatically answers, and she has no impulse control. It just comes out, and she's predicting the future. So she has to be very careful with that. In the process, she ends up saving the butterflies and saving her kingdom, and it's just such a wholesome story. I fully enjoyed it. The last of the books that I do not have a physical copy for is Krakatoa. If you watched my vlog and you heard my thoughts about Krakatoa, this right now is my lowest ranked nonfiction for 2022. After reading this, realized that I have noticed in the past that Simon Winchester has a tendency to be pretentious in his writing. He knows his stuff. That idea comes across in his writing that he knows his stuff, and he wants to tell you and show you that he knows his stuff. It's obnoxious. And as part of it, this whole thing is, the subtitle is The Day the World Exploded. So you would think that this book is going to talk about the day that the world exploded, the day that Krakatoa exploded, and the aftermath of it. Well, it does tell that, but not about until 40% into the book. What is that first 40%? It's like sciencey stuff about the development of volcanoes and a few other things that I've forgotten because it was so unnecessary to the book that it felt like a slog to get through, and I almost DNF'd. But I'm like, okay, I'm going to give it some time when I am not super sleepy, because I was reading it right before I went to bed. I'm like, okay, I'm not giving it a fair shot. So I did, and I got through that, and I got to the point where Krakatoa explodes, and it becomes a little bit more readable. And I'm able to get through, and I'm like, okay, this is not the best book, but I'll be able to finish it. I almost DNF'd it again in like the second to last or third to last chapter, which I know I wouldn't have actually DNF'd it, but I seriously considered it. And that was because of how he dealt with the turn of Indonesia, the increasing influence of Islam in Indonesia. At the point of the explosion of Krakatoa, Indonesia is still a Dutch colony. And the Dutch are obviously Protestant, so Christian. But after this, there is a turn towards Islam. And now the most populous Muslim country in the world is Indonesia. When he started talking about this, I thought, why are you talking about this? This does not seem to be connected to the explosion of Krakatoa. This does not really seem like one of those consequences that you should be talking about. Now, I understand part of it. Part of it was a diminished influence of the Dutch as a result of all this trauma, and then the Indonesians wanting independence. But the thing that bothered me was some subtle word choices and phrasing that Winchester used to describe this turn towards Islam. One of the words that he used was Mohammedans. That is an antiquated name for Muslims. And it was used a lot by colonizers, specifically the British. And Simon Winchester is British. But Simon Winchester published this book in 2003. And when I say antiquated, I mean it was the term used by people writing about this in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it is tied with the concept of inferiority, because a lot of colonizers would tie anything non-Christian to the idea of inferiority and put that in with social Darwinism. Knowing that history, seeing him use that term to describe Muslims, and seeing a few other phrases that I don't remember specifically, it sent up red flags to me. And that whole chapter, there were just subtle things. He wasn't coming straight out and saying this was the worst thing that could have happened to Indonesia, but he comes pretty close. He implies it, and if you know what you're looking for and you see it, it's insidious in its subtleness, but also the ideas that he's conveying. That's why when that came up, completely unnecessary after everything that had already happened in the book, I almost DNF'd it with like 25, 30 pages to go. It was not fun reading those last 25 to 30 pages. I got through it and can count it as a finished book. I also don't consider it a waste, because I did learn what that would look like in a piece of history or literature. Next, I read the second of the physical arcs that I have received. This one is from Candlewick Press. I won this through Library Thing. I really wanted to enjoy this more than I did. I gave it a 3.5, so above average, not a bad book, but not one that I'll be holding on to either. I'm going to be donating it. I love this cover. The cover design is brilliant. One of the things that gave me pause before I started reading When I read the summary, I thought, I've read this before. I've read a lot of similar concepts before. Linda Williams Jackson needs to do something different with it for it to wow me or even make more of a positive impact. She didn't. It felt like I'd seen it before so many times. And I don't want to take away from the fact that a lot of this comes from her lived experience. Now, she would be about a decade younger than Ellis Earl, the main character, but she did grow up in the same area that this book takes place. And it's the Mississippi Delta. And Ellis Earl and his family live in a very small, very rundown house, very low in the Mississippi Delta, so that if it rains a lot, they literally cannot leave their house because the roads flood. And speaking of the family, there are 11 people in the family, including his niece from an older sister who has died. His siblings, I forget how many siblings there are. One of his siblings, his younger brother, who's 11 months younger, is very sick, and they never say what he's sick with. But it could just be a chronic illness brought on by malnutrition and poor living conditions, etc. None of his siblings have been able to go past the 6th grade in school, but he really wants to. Of course, he's educationally gifted. He also has a teacher who takes an interest in him. I believe the teacher is also black, but Jackson never comes out and says. But this teacher takes an interest in him, is trying to help him, and a few other students. Some of the characterization of his sisters. So he has a sister that is also going to school, a younger sister, and a sister who is no longer going to school, is 14, got through 6th grade. Both of them are very mean. They both seem rather unlikable, and the younger one's a spoiled brat, and the older one just feels really hardened and mean. I think Jackson does try to humanize her, soften her a little bit, but it doesn't really work. It doesn't really take. And you don't get enough characterization of the other siblings to care about them. And there's supposed to be 11 people living in that house, and at one point 14 or 15, because his older brother's kids come to stay with them while another baby is being born. So there's a lot going on. Towards the end, the teacher has this opportunity to take kids to meet Bobby Kennedy, when he came to visit Mississippi. A real thing, a documented thing, the year that he attempted to run for president and was assassinated. Along the way, they stop at a restaurant. Everything's supposed to be integrated. It's not. They have a terrible experience there with some very awful things. And the kids, they feel sick about it. It does not feel comfortable. And then they get to the airport, and there's some even worse things that happen, and some ugly racial slurs thrown out. And I'm like, this is a middle grades book and you're putting that in there? Not the fact that racial slurs were thrown out, they need to know that, but like the actual slur, which I'm not going to say. And that left a bad taste in my mouth. And then to finish the book, she takes everything and she puts a nice little bow, and it's happily ever after. I love that you want that for them, but the way that you do it, it's definitely Deus Ex Machina, and it doesn't make sense. I know I said a lot of negative things about this. The writing is decent. The storyline could work, which is why it gets a 3.5, but not one that I'm going to hold on to. Next we have Boneshard Emperor. I read this on the 26th as part of Pokeathon with JD Ray Reads. I'm part of her Patreon, and this helped me finish up one of the evolutions of one of the rock Pokemon. I said in my vlog when I started reading this, there were several things that made me gasp out loud, and I was talking to myself while I was reading, and whenever that happens, you know it's going to be a good book. And so I'm going to, because this is the second book in the series, I'm going to be limited in a lot of the details that I can share. One thing that I will remark on is that this book becomes a lot more political than the first book. And I realized that I actually like that. There's so much chess maneuvering throughout this book that kept me on the edge of my seat. A lot of the gasping out loud, a lot of the reveals actually happen early on, but that doesn't mean that they like taper off. I think Andrea Stewart put them at the right spot in the book. And there's no huge, massive reveals that happen, you know, the 3/4 of the way through like you would think. There's one where if you're paying attention, you can pick up on what that reveal is. And when it happens, it's not so much of a, like it was at the first with the other thing, but it's like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I wonder how this is going to affect the third book. And it's a good kind of reveal. And so I'm so glad I've already pre-ordered the third book. There is a relationship that develops in here that I'm not 100% sure about if I like or not. I love the characters in this relationship a lot. I love the dynamic of when they came together. I can't say the other part because that would be spoilers. I'm not so much sure that I like them as a pairing or that I like the relationship yet. I could still be convinced, but that is minimal throughout the book, the whole love part. It's very political, very nuanced. I really like the relationship between Falou and Rashani. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm not gonna look it up right now. I think that develops really well, and Rashani dealing with her formerly being part of, or still being part of, it's unclear, the Shardless few who tried to assassinate Falou. And I mean, that's not a spoiler. The Shardless few don't want any governors or the emperor. She's having to deal with that and what it means for Falou, the woman she loves, and then also taking in a gutter orphan, which Rashani used to be, Ayesh, as a character. I really, really like her. I love the fact there weren't a lot of new characters added, which is a good thing. When you have so much political things, there were minor characters involved, like governors of different islands. I'm just so intrigued by this book. I cannot wait for the third one to come out, and I don't think it's coming out until next year. So that's going to be a long, sad wait. But really enjoyed this. So the second to last book that I read in the month of February is The Hammer of Thor. The Hammer of Thor is the second book in the Magnus Chase series. I was a little nervous going into this because the last I remembered of this series was not vibing with it. And that was probably when it came out. And since this book came out in 2016, I was, I guess, in a much different place. So I didn't vibe with it. I didn't like it. I don't even remember why. I probably would have a very different opinion now than I did then, because I loved this book. I think that Rick Riordan did an absolutely amazing job with this book, and I talked about some of those things in my reading vlog for that week. One of the things that made me think, wait, I was wrong about this, was when, so they have to go back to Hearthstone's home world, and I don't know how to pronounce a lot of these, so I'm just gonna leave it at that. And Hearthstone is an elf. He hasn't been back home since he left originally. Apparently everything was like terrible, and he's got like, his dad was not supportive. And then we get there. So Hearthstone, the elf, is deaf, and that was part of his problem at home, was he wasn't valued for that, and his parents blamed him for his brother's death. And you find out it's because he couldn't hear the creature that was coming and that attacked his brother. They blame him for the brother's death. And they also think that they also think that sign language is like hand waving, is what his dad calls it. And there's this idea that you get when they first meet a couple characters in this world, some cops, that if you are anything less than exactly perfect, you are less than, you are inferior. It's really interesting the way that they treat Magnus before they find out that he's a son of Frey, and then after. Very interesting. And there's also a scene with one of the servants in Hearthstone's home. There's actually a quote from here that I wrote down that I remembered. A quote from a middle grades book. I just thought it was fantastic. I was so angry at Hearthstone's dad and how he's treating him. I'm like, this is wrong. And for Rick Riordan to be able to engender that sort of sympathy, that sort of reaction, it's amazing. And he does that throughout the book. There's a lot of different representation throughout this book of a lot of different things. The fact that this book is written by a white man, you could think that this could be tokenization, but this really felt like Rick Riordan is learning about all of these different things, and he's seeing that through Magnus's eyes, and he's showing people, this is how you need to change. Like, seeing something, seeing the wrongness of it, and going, I gotta do something about that, which I admire so much. So yeah, you've got the whole quest thing, you've got Loki being ridiculous, as Loki always is. I mean, that's there, but the big thing for me was the way that Riordan uses these characters, uses Magnus as the main character to really show, hey, the way that we look at a lot of things is not necessarily right. And this is what we need to do about it. The last book that I read in the month of February was an audiobook, South to America. So I also have an e-arc copy of this, but I read it as an audiobook. I have talked about in my reading vlog for the last week of February, because I have also read How the Word Is Passed this year. Both books have a similar premise, a similar idea of the author taking a journey and exploring how things are portrayed. They're slightly different, but they have a very similar premise. But the way that Clint Smith in How the Word Is Passed executes on that premise makes South to America pale in comparison. And the biggest problem for me was not her writing. Her writing is phenomenal. There were so many times as I was listening that there were quotes, I'm like, wow, that's powerful. That is a very astute observation. That's something we need to know. The problem comes with the lack of a coherent framework, a framework to hold and guide the narrative. And because there's nothing to guide it, it sort of wanders all over the place. And because it does that, it sort of causes you to lose attention, lose the thread of the narrative. And so several times I had to think back and go, wait a second, what is she trying to prove? Oh, okay, so that's it. So that's why I rated it 3.5 stars, because it's good, it's above average. That lack of structure is what ultimately, not doomed, but that's the best word I can think of, doomed the book. So I ended it on sort of a high note because I finished The Hammer of Thor, which I just talked about. But then this was the last complete book that I read in the month of February. So that completes my February wrap up. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of these physical books anymore because I had to send them back to the library. But I had a really good reading month. Now, I had more 5 stars in the first half of the month than in the second half of the month. I'm really getting into a groove with analyzing books and reading and finding out what I like. So I'm really having fun on this reading journey, and I hope that you will join me as I go along and in my future videos. Thanks so much for watching.